The house still carried Richard's scent, though he had been gone for weeks. Every corner reminded me of him, his chair by the window. The framed photographs he insisted stay on the mantel. The rose bushes outside he used to trim on Sunday mornings. I invited Thomas and Rachel over for dinner, hoping their company might soften the silence that had grown unbearable. I set the table carefully, folding the napkins the way Richard liked, even though my hands trembled. The children, Evan and Sophie, filled the kitchen with laughter, and for a moment I let myself believe the evening would be gentle. But as we sat down, Thomas's expression hardened. He barely touched the roast chicken I had prepared. Rachel sipped her wine, watching him, not me. The conversation drifted toward my future, what I planned to do now that Richard was gone. I told them I wanted to stay in the house, tend the garden, keep the routines that gave me a sense of him. Thomas leaned back, his fork clattering onto the plate. "You can't keep living like this. Mom, you're a burden. Go live in a nursing home." The words struck harder than I imagined anything could after burying my husband. A silence fell over the table. Evan looked up from his plate, confused. Sophie reached for Rachel's hand, but Rachel only lowered her eyes, saying nothing. I forced myself to stay composed. Though my chest felt as though it had collapsed, I looked at my son, my only child, and saw not the boy Richard and I had raised, but a man weighed down by resentment and something darker I could not yet name. I swallowed my grief in silence, already sensing that this moment was only the beginning of something far more painful. That night, after the children were tucked into the guest room and Thomas and Rachel had gone home, I sat alone at the kitchen table. The clock ticked louder than usual, and in the silence I felt Richard's absence pressing in on me. His chair sat empty, the cushion indented as if he might return at any moment. Memories flooded me, our first years of marriage, when we could barely afford rent. How Richard took extra shifts so I could finish my library science degree. When Thomas was born, Richard promised our son would never want for anything. He kept that promise, working long hours, saving every extra dollar. We paid Thomas's tuition in full, even when it meant postponing our own dreams. When he wanted to buy his first house in Charlotte, we signed over a portion of our savings to help him with the down payment. I remember the look in Richard's eyes then, a mixture of pride and worry. Later, when we were alone, he told me, "Marjorie, I hope we haven't spoiled him. He's reckless with money. He doesn't think ahead." I brushed his words aside, insisting Thomas would find his footing. I wanted to believe our sacrifices had given him stability. Now those words returned with a sharpness I could no longer ignore. My son's cold sentence at dinner was not a moment of stress or grief. It was a mirror reflecting years of habits I had chosen not to see. Perhaps Richard had been right. Perhaps I had confused unconditional love with blind faith. The walls of the house felt heavier that night, the silence stretching until it was almost unbearable. I pressed my palms together, whispering into the dark, not sure if I was speaking to Richard or to myself. I realized then that my grief was no longer only for my husband, but for the son I thought I knew. And as I rose from the table, a cold certainty began to settle. In Thomas's words were not the end of his intentions. They were only the beginning. In the weeks that followed, Thomas and Rachel began appearing at my doorstep more often than they ever had when Richard was alive. At first I told myself it was kindness, their way of making sure I wasn't alone, but it didn't take long for their true purpose to show itself. They arrived one Saturday morning with a stack of glossy brochures tucked under Rachel's arm. She spread them across my dining room table as if she were showing me vacation packages. "Look, Mom," she said brightly. "These new assisted living communities outside Charlotte are nothing like the old-fashioned nursing homes. Pools, fitness classes, medical care right on site. It's safer for you. And closer to us." Thomas nodded. Flipping one open to a photograph of a smiling couple walking along manicured lawns. You'd have your own suite. No more worrying about yard work or repairs. And you wouldn't have to live in this big, drafty house all by yourself. I folded my hands in my lap and studied their faces. Behind the cheerful tones, I could see calculation. A certain urgency that had little to do with my comfort. Rachel kept pointing out amenities, but her eyes flicked toward the window. The backyard. The garden. Richard had tended for decades. Over the next few visits, they pressed harder. They suggested selling the house while the market is strong, hinting at how much money could be freed up for my care. One afternoon, I looked out to see Thomas in the yard with a tape measure, jotting notes while Rachel snapped photos of the exterior. When I stepped outside, they laughed nervously and claimed they were just curious about the square footage. I smiled politely, but my unease grew heavier each time they came. The home Richard and I had built together was no longer a sanctuary in their eyes, it was a prize. As I closed the door behind them that evening, I felt the chill of certainty that they were moving toward something I was not yet meant to see. And that certainty followed me into the next day. The following week, I was trimming the rose bushes when Helen Porter, my neighbor of nearly 30 years, leaned over the fence. She had the look of someone carrying a secret too heavy to keep. Marjorie. She began carefully. I don't mean to meddle, but I thought you should know something. Her eyes flicked toward my house. Then back to me. The other afternoon, I saw Thomas out here with a camera. He was walking the perimeter, taking pictures of the siding and the yard. And Rachel? She stopped me last week to ask if you had the original deed to the house handy. Her words stilled my hands. I tried to laugh it off, but the sound died in my throat. Helen reached for my arm. I don't like the feel of it. Be careful. That night, after pacing the length of my living room, I pulled out Richard's old address book and dialed David Klein, the attorney who had helped us with our will years ago. His calm, steady voice answered, and when I explained what Helen had seen, he sighed heavily. Marjorie, I wish I could tell you it's nothing, but Thomas's situation is precarious. He's behind on his mortgage, at least 3 payments. There are 2 lawsuits pending from clients who claim he misrepresented properties, and his credit is stretched thin. If he can't secure funds soon, he risks foreclosure. I clutched the phone tighter. So you think the house, my house, is what they're after? I can't say for certain, but the timing, it fits. You need to be cautious. Don't sign anything. Don't hand over any documents, no matter how harmless they look. I thanked him, though my heart was pounding too hard to feel relief. When I hung up, I stood in the quiet living room staring at the photographs on the mantel our wedding day. Thomas as a boy, Richard smiling with pride. The house had been built with love, brick by brick, memory by memory. And now it was clear, to Thomas and Rachel, it was nothing more than leverage. I knew then I could no longer afford to wait for their next move. That night, I barely slept, Richard's voice echoing in my head as clearly as if he were still sitting beside me. Be careful with him. Marjorie, he doesn't see consequences the way you do. I had brushed that warning aside once. I wouldn't do it again. The next morning, I drove to the bank where Richard and I had always kept our savings. I asked to see a private banker and explained I wanted to move my funds into a separate account. The young man behind the desk looked surprised at the size of the transfer. But I met his eyes steadily. This account is to remain private. No joint access. No one but me. He nodded, processing the paperwork with the quiet efficiency I needed. By the time I walked out, the bulk of my savings was beyond Thomas's reach. From there, I went to David Klein's office. He welcomed me into the same oak-paneled room where Richard and I had once signed our first will. My hands trembled slightly as I laid out what I needed. I want to update everything. I told him, Thomas is to be removed as primary beneficiary. Instead, I want funds directed to literacy charities and college trusts for Evan and Sophie. They deserve a future untainted by their parents' mistakes. David studied me carefully. Are you sure about this? As sure as I've ever been. The revisions were drafted that afternoon. I signed each page with a clarity that steadied me. Even as sadness pricked at my heart, Richard would have approved. I could almost feel him standing behind me, resting a hand on my shoulder. Back at home, I sat at the kitchen table and wrote 2 letters. One for Thomas, to be left where he would find it after I was gone. It explained nothing he deserved to know, only that I had chosen my own path. The second I sealed for David, with instructions should anything happen to me. When I finished, the sun had set and the house was quiet, but I felt something I hadn't in weeks resolve. Whatever came next, I would not face it passively. The decision was made, and all that remained was to act. The house was quiet when I made my choice. I moved slowly, careful not to disturb the creaks in the old floorboards, folding only what I needed into a single suitcase, a few changes of clothes, my medication, a leather folder of documents, and the photograph of Richard and me on our anniversary in Charleston. I slipped my wedding ring into the inside pocket of my purse, pressed my palm against the kitchen table one last time, and walked to the door without looking back. The cab arrived just after midnight, headlights slicing across the driveway. The driver, a young man with kind eyes, helped me load my bag. Asheville Regional, he asked. I nodded, keeping my voice steady. The city slid by in silence. The mountains shadowed against the sky, and with every mile I felt both heavier and lighter at once. At the airport, I bought a one-way ticket to Denver. Richard had always spoken of the Rockies, of seeing the vast peaks we'd only ever admired in photographs. Now it would be me, alone, fulfilling a dream he never reached. When the plane lifted into the dark sky, I closed my eyes and whispered his name, trusting he would understand. By morning, the first cracks appeared in Thomas's plans. While I settled into a modest hotel in Denver's Cherry Creek district, he was on the phone with a resort in Florida, attempting to book a family package on my credit card. The transaction failed. He tried again, declined. Frustrated, he called the bank, only to hear the words that would undo him. The account is empty, sir. It was closed by the account holder yesterday. I could picture the color draining from his face, the dawning realization that his safety net had vanished. For me, that knowledge was enough. I pulled the curtains of my hotel room open, letting the sharp Colorado sunlight pour in. A new horizon waited, and for the first time since Richard's funeral, I allowed myself to breathe freely, knowing the hardest part was yet to come. While I tried to steady myself in Denver, Thomas and Rachel's world in Charlotte began to crack. The mortgage notices they had pushed aside for months became impossible to ignore. 3 months behind, the bank's letters shifted from polite reminders to formal warnings. Credit card bills piled up, each one stamped with late fees they could no longer manage. Neighbors started whispering. Rachel's Lexus was seen parked outside their house more often than usual, not at her part-time job. A rumor circulated that Thomas had borrowed heavily from colleagues in real estate, promising returns that never came. The illusion of control that he wore so easily at family dinners began to unravel in public. Inside their home, the tension turned sharp. Evan and Sophie, too young to understand the details, heard the raised voices through thin walls. "Why did Grandma leave?" Evan asked one night, his voice trembling. Rachel tried to hush him, but Sophie, wide-eyed, whispered. Was it because of us? Those words only deepened the cracks. Thomas stormed through the house, slamming doors, blaming Rachel for pushing too hard, the market for collapsing, even me for refusing to play the role he had assigned me, but never himself. Rachel snapped back. reminding him that he had promised her stability, that his choices had led them here. Their arguments spilled into the yard, visible to neighbors who no longer looked away. Through all of it, the children withdrew. Evan stopped inviting friends over. Sophie clutched the drawing of me she had made months earlier, keeping it hidden under her pillow. The warmth of family life shrank into silence, punctuated by shouting matches. By the end of that month, a foreclosure notice was taped to their front door. Rachel tore it down, but the neighbors had already seen. The house that had once been a symbol of their ambition now stood as evidence of collapse. And as their desperation grew, I knew it was only a matter of time before Thomas would start searching for me, convinced that I held the solution to problems of his own making. The apartment I found in Cherry Creek was modest, a one-bedroom with creaking floors and a small balcony that overlooked a row of maple trees. It was nothing like the home Richard and I had built, but it was mine alone, untouched by anyone else's plans. Each morning, I opened the curtains wide, letting the Colorado sun spill across the room, reminding myself that I had chosen this life. In those early weeks, I searched for something to occupy my hands and mind. A flyer at the local library caught my eye, a literacy program seeking volunteers. I walked in the next day, nervous at first, but the director welcomed me warmly. Soon I was sitting with adults struggling through paragraphs, children sounding out words, and I felt a spark I hadn't known in years. The work gave me more than purpose. It gave me people. Other volunteers invited me for coffee. Neighbors asked about my background. And for once, no one measured me by what I owned. I was simply Marjorie, the woman who listened patiently and laughed easily when someone stumbled over a difficult word. One evening after class, walking back beneath the city's amber streetlights, I realized I hadn't thought about Thomas or Rachel all day. The weight of their voices, their demands, had slipped further from me. Freedom was no longer just the absence of their control. It was the rediscovery of who I had been before grief and betrayal. As I unlocked my apartment door, I knew that I had begun to carve out a life where I could breathe again. But deep down, I also understood that the past was not finished with me, and sooner or later, it would come knocking. The months in Denver gave me clarity I hadn't felt in years. With David's steady guidance over long-distance calls, I finalized the sale of my Asheville home. It was painful to let go of the place where Richard and I had built our life, but I knew it had to serve a different purpose now. The proceeds, along with my savings, became the foundation of something new, the Keaton Foundation for Senior Literacy. The idea had taken root during my volunteer work. I saw older adults struggling to navigate everyday life because they couldn't read with confidence, filling prescriptions, applying for jobs, even reading letters from their grandchildren. I knew I could help. Naming the foundation after our family was deliberate. I wanted to redefine what the Keaton name meant, not as a symbol of entitlement, but of renewal and dignity. When the local press covered the launch, I found myself pictured in the paper, standing with a group of smiling seniors holding brand new books. The article described me as a widow who turned loss into legacy. For the first time since Richard's passing, I felt proud, not just of surviving, but of creating something meaningful. Meanwhile, David kept me informed of developments back home. Thomas had received official notice of the updated will. The charities were listed as primary beneficiaries, with trusts secured for Evan and Sophie. His name was nowhere to be found. According to David, his reaction was volcanic rage, threats, desperate calls that went unanswered. But without legal standing, his fury was powerless. I could almost picture him pacing the bare rooms of his foreclosed house, railing against a reality he could no longer control. And though part of me mourned the boy I had once raised, I knew there was no turning back from the choice I had made. Years passed, and Denver became the only place I thought of as home. The foundation grew beyond what I had ever imagined: new classrooms, dozens of volunteers, and lives changed by something as simple and powerful as the ability to read. I carried Richard's memory with me through every step, knowing he would have been proud. One afternoon, as I left a meeting with the board, I saw him waiting by the entrance. Thomas looked older than his years. His shoulders slumped, his eyes hollow. The confidence that once bordered on arrogance had drained from him, leaving only weariness. "Mom," he said softly, his voice breaking, "I came to ask for forgiveness. I know I don't deserve it. I lost everything, and I don't want to lose you, too." I stood still, studying the man who had once been my child. There was no anger left in me, only a quiet certainty. "Thomas," I answered, "you no longer hold any part of me. My life is not yours to control, and it never will be again." His face crumpled, and for a moment he looked like the boy I had carried on my hip, crying over a scraped knee, but there was no healing I could give him now. He nodded, turned, and walked away without another word. I stepped back inside the building, where voices of students echoed down the hall, laughter and determination filling the rooms. Surrounded by the work I had built, I felt peace settle over me. My victory had never been about revenge. It was about choosing my own freedom, living with dignity, and finding purpose beyond betrayal. And in that, I had won completely.